Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hannah Green, and I am the life sciences reporter at the Boston Business Journal. And today I'm really looking forward to moderating a conversation with our panelists about how advances in areas like mRNA have led to new cancer treatments, such as cancer vaccines. Before we dive into today's conversation, I would love to have each of our panelists briefly introduce themselves and just give us a little bit of background on you and the work you do in this space. Patrick, could we start with you?
My name is Patrick Ott. I'm a medical oncologist. I work at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute here in Boston. I've spent the last decade developing what we call personalized cancer vaccines. We'll get a little bit more into the details later on. I'm seeing exclusively patients with melanoma, so I'm really subspecialized on the clinical side and spend about half of my time in the translational field, basically developing these vaccines.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline Rosenblatt. I'm the Associate Chief of the Division of Hematology and Heme Malignancies at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center and an Associate Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. And I lead our clinical cell therapy lab where we manufacture vaccines and cell therapies for patients. I'm also a physician. I care for patients mostly with multiple myeloma and acute leukemia. Thanks for having me here.
Hi, my name is Kyle Holen. I am also a medical oncologist by training. I took care of patients for quite some time before moving into industry. So I worked at a company called AbbVie for quite some time. And then a few years ago, I moved over to Moderna. And I managed the clinical trials for our oncology products, as well as our rare disease and other therapeutic mRNAs. Great to be here.
Thank you all. Patrick, I'm going to come back to you now. And let's talk a little bit about what exactly is a cancer vaccine. Can you give us a little bit of a primer of maybe some of the history of development in this space and what a cancer vaccine looks like and does?
All right, absolutely. So, and it looks like you have already in the conference today talked about vaccines. So I think it's probably helpful to start with a concept to realize what does a vaccine do? So it's actually quite simple. You basically train the immune system against an antigen. So we call basically, let's say the COVID virus, right? So a coronavirus basically is an antigen. As it enters the body, it basically stimulates an immune response because it's foreign, as we say, so it's basically different from the normal body. Typically, actually, the immune system shouldn't have a problem recognizing that. The same concept can be applied to cancer. And what's attractive about it is because you can, again, actually train the immune system very specifically against something that shouldn't be in the body, which in this case would obviously be the cancer cells, right? It is just more complicated when it's cancer cells because, as you can imagine, cancer cells are number one, they're not really foreign, right? So they're derived from normal cells. And so they're in part actually self, but they're also not normal, and in a way they're cancer cells, right? And so historically, and I will actually say over the last 100 years, we have known that cancers can actually induce an immune response. This has actually been used therapeutically by a surgeon in New York, more than 100 years ago, where they basically injected bacteria toxin into tumors, sarcoma in that case, and it would shrink basically. And that we think of this commonly as sort of the beginning of this field of therapeutically manipulating the immune response specifically against tumor. And I think it's just, so there's obviously cancer immunotherapy that some of you may have heard about, and this is actually a really impressively developing field where we have multiple drugs that we use actively in the clinic that are, hundreds of thousands of patients, I will say, actually have benefited from these drugs. The cancer vaccines are more specific and a little bit less developed, but there has been recently quite a bit of excitement that they may actually also come into the clinic fairly soon.
Thank you. And yes, let's definitely talk about what's happening now. What are the most recent developments in this area? I think, Kyle, we'll go to you next to talk a little bit about what Moderna is doing. Moderna, of course, basically becoming synonymous with mRNA because of your work with the COVID-19 vaccine during the pandemic. when and kind of how did Moderna kind of parlay this into cancer, and what is in the works right now?
Well, what a lot of people don't realize is Moderna was actually working on a cancer vaccine before the pandemic, and it predates the work that we were doing for the COVID vaccine. So it's something that we've had our sights on at Moderna for a long time. When I decided to leave my previous employer and come to Moderna, a lot of people raised their eyebrows and they said, Kyle, you're a medical oncologist. Why are you going to a COVID company to develop COVID vaccines? I said, well, I think when you find out about how we're using that technology to fight cancer, you may realize why it was so important for me to make this leap. But essentially, what we're doing is taking the mRNA technology that we've developed and that people are familiar with for the COVID vaccine and applying it to cancer. And there have been advancements in the field, as you outlined, that have all converged to allow us to create something like our personalized therapy for cancer. And those technologies include things like DNA sequencing. It wasn't that long ago, 2003, when we first sequenced the human genome. And now, 20 years later, you can walk into your doctor's office and for a couple $100, figure out if you have DNA in the blood and get it sequenced. And it's really incredible how far we've come. But that, along with machine learning and with RNA technology and with the advancements in immune therapy in the field, we've taken all these technologies and created what we call our individualized neoantigen therapy. And what it is it's a treatment that we works just like a vaccine. We target specific neoantigens on the cancer, and we teach the T cells to attack those neoantigens through a vaccination type approach. And excited about it, and we're also excited about the potential in the field. There's many different players in the field that are all working on cancer vaccines, and we're just one part of that, but excited to see some early promising results.
And maybe it'll be helpful to point out that, so why is this actually personalized, right? So there's a lot of, like, particularly in cancer, there's a lot of talk about like personalized treatments. But I'm always saying, like, those personalized vaccines are actually really the only truly personalized drug that we have so far, where there's literally a specific drug being created for an individual patient. So personalized could be like, well, your doctor treats a cancer because the cancer has a certain mutation or so, but they basically take an off-the-shelf drug and give it based on that information. But with those personalized vaccines, you really have to make the drug new, custom make it for every patient. That makes it, on one hand, like very complicated, right? So it actually takes some time to make those vaccines. Why is that? It's really because like each individual cancer has a different set of mutations, and that's what Kyle was just explaining, right? So basically you have to do this sequencing from scratch for each patient.
Yeah, when we make this vaccine, we have to make sure that it's labeled for that individual person, because nobody else should receive that specific vaccine. It has to be for that individual because we've created that based on the mutation patterns in their tumor. It's astounding that we're in an age where we can do this. I'm not familiar with any other therapy that exists that is really only made for one person and one person only. And that's what we're doing with INT.
Kyle, can I quickly ask you a follow-up there on what does the scalability of that look like as you look to a future beyond the trial?
That is an amazing question, and I had the same question myself. I said, how can we possibly make enough when each therapy is individualized? But I've been amazed by my manufacturing colleagues and what they can do. As an example, they were able to start from essentially nothing and make 1 billion doses of COVID vaccine in a matter of less than a year. If they can scale up to 1 billion doses of COVID vaccine, they can scale up this process too, and I've just seen incredible things happen.
Now, Jacqueline and Patrick, coming back to the two of you, can you tell us a little bit about research that you're doing in this cancer vaccine space, or things just generally in the broader field that you're seeing that you think is really interesting, perhaps really relevant to the patients that you're working with?
Right, maybe I can start with that, and I would say I can maybe give you a little bit of an overview of, we have focused for many years now on a whole cell vaccine approach, and so the concept here is that we take tumor cells from patients. We've been doing it in the blood cancer, so we take it from the bone marrow, and we fuse the tumor cells to dendritic cells, which are cells that stimulate the immune system. And so this is sort of a different approach, kind of broadly capturing shared antigens, neoantigens, anonymous antigens, identified antigens, just broadly sort of immunizing against the diversity of an individual's clone. And we've taken this now, we've brought cancer centers from across the country, and in an open source way really just taught everybody in the academic setting how to make vaccine, and have done randomized trials. And so I think it's really exciting to think about how industry and academia can collaborate to maybe bring these technologies together, and I think really learn from each other's approaches is going to be really exciting going forward.
But so I think it's like when you mentioned you can like learn from your hundreds or probably thousands of patients at some point. I have to say
1,089 to be exact.
In
our
the melanoma
study.
Yeah, I know. But it's quite, that is like an opportunity in it by itself that like hasn't been there for the field, right? So I think the field actually has been struggling a little bit like with some of the things that I first said, like, we are excited about like these small studies that we do and we can learn, but part of the problem is also that in particularly actually the cancer vaccine field has been historically over the last 40 years, so basically the majority has been small studies, and it's a reflection of this having been largely academic, right? Relatively small studies that never really sort of got to the finish line. And there was like some studies that were actually larger. There were certainly phase 3 trials that have been actually not successful. But again, like what I said before, right? So we know that if you vaccinate against us, or we now know, and we always have known that like certain antigens are not ideal, right? So if you just, and I think we probably haven't like sort of the idea of actually vaccinating against not just one antigen, right? I think we haven't really conveyed that enough. I think it's really one of the concept of these personalized vaccine is like you don't put all your eggs in the basket and train the immune response against that one antigen that the tumor has expressed there, but there's like potentially 100, right? So one way to get around it is like what Jacqueline said, like the idea of like basically vaccinating with a whole tumor, right? So you think like, okay, you just use the whole tumor, you kill it, and like use that as a vaccine. When we started with a personalized vaccine, we said like, well, we actually have to focus on the ones that we think are most relevant, right? Which are those neoantigens. And I think that that is still the belief, but I think part of why we think that's important is like we call it clonal evolution. The cancer just like typically, it's not just the one antigen. We think that you probably need more than one shot on goal. So that's just like going back to like these large trials in the field that had been just targeting one antigen, they were negative, and people was like, well, cancer vaccines don't work, right? So we now know that this is like not the case. But nevertheless, I think there is a real opportunity to have large trials and learn from them, and hopefully, like, even if some of them are like negative, right? If they're then actually used and basically remember, so those like innovations will only be able to be applied sort of in the next study, right? So if like people say like that study didn't turn out, why is that? Oh, now we have the knowledge actually to make it better, right? But you need a little bit that long-term view.
I would just also say we're talking about large trials, and we're used to thinking about large trials in the context of chemotherapy, but I think we should also be open to thinking about, as we're thinking about such personalized treatments and targeted approaches for each individual, that learning from the large trials has a role, but it may be that it's going to be really important to understand biomarkers to really select the right treatment for the right person at the right time, and some of that gets lost in the noise of a positive or a negative large trial. So I think the way trials are designed is probably also going to change in the coming years, and that's going to be really important.
I want to take us now to talking a little bit more about the patient experience and what that could look like for people in the future, maybe receiving these cancer vaccines. Whoever wants to take this first, what would these cancer vaccines potentially look like as part of someone's care in combination with other things? And what could that mean for them, for their future?
So I'd say, like, having done trials over the last 10 years, from the patient's perspective, like, the main difference with a personalized vaccine is that the drug is basically not available when you start the treatment. So that's a little bit, we talked some about this already. You actually have to find, as we say, like, the right setting, right? So a patient has like a very advanced tumor that is growing, just quickly. You're not going to be able to, like, give them a drug where you have to wait, let's say, even if it's just 4 weeks or 6 weeks. That's just not possible. But other than that, the treatment for the patient, I would say one, like, important feature that we actually also haven't really mentioned, these vaccines are, like, extremely well tolerated, right? So there's, like, as opposed to a lot of other cancer treatments, some of them have, like, deadly side effects, some of them need, like, hospitalization, they need, like, additional, like, cell therapy is, like, an important and really effective, like, new field now too. But that's, like, a totally different ballgame from the patient's perspective, right? So if a patient, I'm sure you may have heard about CAR T cells, heard of, like, bone marrow transplant. Any cell therapy will require patients to, like, go to the hospital for, like, weeks, get, like, additional treatment, get chemotherapy. The vaccine is basically a shot in the clinic, right? And you can basically really reliably. So we have tested the vaccines in, as we said, like, right, hundreds of millions, billions of patients, right? So we know they're safe. And I think that actually gives an opportunity so that we can combine them more. There's more opportunities. Typically, like, in the clinic, from the patient perspective, you're always limited by, like, how toxic a drug is, right? So if you get, like, one drug that doesn't really quite do the trick, you can only combine it with another drug if that drug is not already, like, super toxic, right? And so the vaccine by themselves, they should really actually not add. So which really in it by itself provides opportunities. But then since you said so that the pure patient perspective is actually, it's just like they get the treatment with the vaccines. It will likely be given with another drug in combination, and so it's actually fairly seamless, I'd say.
Yeah, I just want to add on to that. I completely agree that because of the limited side effect profile of vaccines, you can combine with things that you might not have been able to combine other agents with, like ipi-nivo and melanoma. But the other opportunity is to go into places where maybe you couldn't go with chemotherapy or immune therapies, like earlier stages of treatment. And what's really exciting for me is the technology that exists right now to check someone's blood for circulating tumor DNA. And oftentimes we're doing this just to see if someone's going to recur, or even as a screening tool. And if you happen to be in your doctor's office and you ask for the Gallery test, which is a blood test to check to see if you had circulating tumor DNA, and that came out positive, and you couldn't find cancer anywhere, you may not want to just get toxic chemotherapy for a circulating tumor DNA positive test, but you possibly would be willing to take a vaccine for that.
Jacqueline, as we come to the end of our time, can I come to you one last time to speak about what these cancer vaccines could mean as someone, you see patients so often, what these could mean for them, what that could look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think patients are always really excited about the potential to use any treatment that's capitalizing on their own immune system. And I think, what you're talking about preventing disease or preventing recurrence, I think is really the place probably where vaccines will go. If you think about an infectious disease model, we're not using vaccines to treat when people have active infection. We have antibiotics for that. It's to prevent infection. And I think if we're thinking 10 to 20 years down the line, I hope that that's where we'll be with cancer vaccines.
Well, thank you, each of you, for your time today. Everyone, please join me in thanking our panelists for this panel this afternoon.
Thank you.
We hope you'll stick around for the next event coming up right after this one. Thank you so much.